Good afternoon, everyone. Already see a lot of people joining us for this webinar. Welcome, everyone. We'll be waiting another minute or so before we start the webinar. Maybe already welcoming everyone and asking you to maybe also say a quick hi in the chat and share with us where you're calling in from. Welcome, everyone. It is 4 o'clock. We'll be shortly starting. Waiting another minute as people join in. Welcome, everyone. We see how we have people joining from all over, so I can say good afternoon, but good morning as well, and good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining from. Uruguay, wow, all over. Well then, with that, let's not waste any of the precious time we have today and jump right in as people are joining still. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. Joining today's webinar, How Circular is Your Business, where we will be helping you to identify and apply metrics and indicators to accelerate your circular activities. We're extremely excited about today's session and had a record-breaking number of registrations. So really, thanks all so much for your interest in bringing the circular transition forward with us. Thanks for joining. If we go to the next slide, I can introduce us to a few points of housekeeping for today. We're very curious to also hear from you today throughout this webinar. So in case of any questions that come up to the contents that we share, please share them with us in the Q&A box, and then we'll be trying to answer as many as possible throughout the webinar. Also, if you're experiencing any issues, please raise them in the chat, and then our team can also help you figure those out. That's actually a great moment to also thank Marvin, Katarina, Lena, and Pau for making this webinar possible today. Another one is we'll be using Mentimeter throughout the presentation to also get your inputs. So we'll be supporting to provide the relevant codes in the chat as well. But just so you're aware, we're very much looking to get your input. Last point is we're recording this session, and we'll also provide you with the link and slides after the webinar, which will last 1 hour. So moving on, actually, I can quickly introduce myself. My name is Casper. I'm a program manager on metrics for the circular economy at Circular Economy. I'll be moderating today's session. And maybe to start with, I'll also give a quick word on Circular Economy as an organization. We're a foundation based out of Amsterdam, and we're pursuing the bold vision of an economic system that ensures both planet and people can thrive alongside each other, which we want to achieve through a circular economy. And the role that we take is we support businesses and cities and nations with a range of solutions to put their circular economy ambitions to action. And you guessed it, metrics are a core topic in that for us. So that's why we're delighted that today we can dive deeper into their application in the context of businesses. And with that, I would like to introduce my colleague Jacco to you, who leads our business solutions team. So he has quite some experience in navigating the field of circular metrics with them, with the businesses. And he will tell us, first of all, why we started measuring the circular economy more closely and monitoring it. He'll walk us through 6 steps that we need in applying circularity and circular metrics, and will also tell us about 3 main challenges that often are experienced in that process. We'll conclude also in really enlightening you a bit more of why we think everybody needs to take action on this soon. And yeah, without any further ado, handing over to you, Jacco. Thanks so much for joining us today and sharing. Yeah, welcome.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for having me. I'm very excited to see so many people here and from all around the world. So I'm going to do my very best to make this an interesting session for you. Um, I'll start a little bit why we started measuring. And I'm pretty sure I'm not telling you a lot of new things, but if you look at the current linear economy, of course, we're not on the right track here. We can see that we're consuming a lot of materials that's causing a lot of environmental impacts, including greenhouse gas emissions. And we're not using a lot of that material indefinitely. So only 8.5% is actually being reused every year. 90% of wasted. So that's an issue. And that's really core to a lot of the environmental issues that we see these days. Circular economy back in 2017 started really to try and measure the problem. We existed for a few years back then, but we figured that if we could really put a number to it, then it would really get people's attention that this is an issue. So we started monitoring the global economy, and you can see some of the infographics here that we produced out of that. And what we learned is, well, the number you just heard, the global economy is only 8.6% circular. So we're really wasting a lot of our resources. And this is how we started on the journey of metrics. We weren't the very first to be measuring these kind of things, but we were quite early. And when we had this bit of taste on how to measure the global economy, we expanded that to cities, regions, and businesses. And that's, of course, today's topic. It's good to know that it's still at the core of our business. We now have said that we want to double global circularity by 2032. So that's doubling circularity in 10 years. And that's and it's a very deliberate choice to make that decision, because we believe, and the math has showed that if we manage to do that, and all countries will be able to meet their current commitments from Glasgow and Paris, then we'll actually stay well within the 2 degrees scenario for the globe. So that's why we think global circularity is really key right now in managing the climate crisis, and a lot of other environmental benefits, of course, as well. At Circular Economy, we have a couple of ways of doing this, but really the core strategy we always have is to help the change makers, the front runners, the people that really are trying to make a difference, in taking 3 steps. First, to uncover where they are. So how circular are you now? What are your core issues right now? How is your value chain right now? Then envision where they can go. What's your future vision? Where do you want to go in, say, 10, 15, 20 years? And then, of course, closing the gap. So how to get there. That's always our strategy. That's how we are helping our people, our clients, and our partners. And well, you guessed it, to do that, we need circular metrics and indicators. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, specifically for businesses, which is my field of expertise. I'm going to walk you through that, but I'm also very eager to hear more about you and what your questions are. So if you have any questions in between, feel free to pop it into Q&A. My colleagues will then see if they can pass it on to me to answer it for you. But of course, after today, you can also still reach out for a lot of questions that you might have. So that being said, setting the stage, where we now are going to go is, well, it's quite straightforward. We're going to walk you through our approach, our step-by-step approach that we usually take when we apply metrics for a business or a sector. And we usually have kind of the same 6 steps. We figured that because we've done it a couple of times now, we've analyzed over a couple of 100 products. We've helped 30 plus businesses to develop that circular strategy for their business. We figured we just share you step by step what we've encountered, what we've learned, the challenges that we also still face, because there are plenty of that, you won't be surprised. And yeah, just see what that will trigger with you and what kind of questions you will have after that. So I'll start with the first one. Step 1, scope your needs. So why do you ever even need metrics? Why not just go ahead and get started on implementation? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and it really depends a bit on where you are in your innovation journey. And we've really seen companies come in that are anywhere in these 4 steps. So first, you have to create awareness, set a baseline. So where am I currently? What is our current performance? That's also very good in creating awareness amongst your colleagues, your stakeholders. But you can also try and get the next step where people actually start. So what are my biggest opportunities? Where does my business, my value chain, my sector have to focus? What are the opportunities there? If you found a couple of opportunities, you can still use metrics to also more in detail assess and compare the potential of opportunities. So dive more into them, really analyze what is their potential, and up until building a business case that you can really bring to your management and to your investors and get a sign off on. And then obviously the last step is once you've started implementation, you're on your way or actually near the finish line, validate where you are, share your results, and also communicate that to your shareholders, your investors. So in every step along the way here, you need metrics, and sometimes they're very different, and sometimes you can use the same metric a couple of times. So it doesn't really matter where you are in your innovation journey. It's always a good idea to see if you can start measuring. And it's usually not just one indicator. A metric can be one indicator, can be a whole family of indicators. But what we usually see in our work with businesses is that there's not one indicator. You probably need to look at a couple of them, and we kind of find, and there's different ways of categorizing them, but we find different types of them. You have the typical headline indicator, so the one indicator you want to go for. A lot of people talk about how, in percentages, how circular is my business, but it can also be how many resources am I using. Then come the performance indicators. That's usually kind of the indicators that you'll set to your departments or to your suppliers, where they have a specific role to play in getting that bigger headline indicator to move. So it's usually physical interactions with your value chain, the recycling rate, the share of secondary resources in your procurement, the share of renewable energy, etc. It's quite physical still. And then lastly, you have your process indicators, which is actually the easiest one to go into, because it's just measuring, am I already on my track in implementing the strategy that I have? Did I already put KPIs to departments? Are my customers already asking for green products? So these are the kind of indicators that don't immediately affect your headline indicator. If that one process indicator changes, your headline indicator might not actually move, but it does show you how far you are along your way. Not included here, but sometimes also very relevant is the impact indicators, the sustainability indicators, because we're very aware that circular economy is just a means to an end, which is making this world more sustainable. So we usually recommend companies to also check how your headline indicators and performance indicators relate to, say, CO2 or biodiversity, or some of the other the impact indicators, why we're actually in this business. So moving on, this is the first part where I'm going to ask you to join us on Menti. So I'm very eager, and it's also going to steer a little bit what I'm going to talk about further on in my presentation. I'm really eager to hear what your priority is. Where are you in your innovation journey with your organization? Or if you're not from an organization yourself, just picture your favorite brand and where do you think they are? Are they still in a phase where they need to create awareness? Or are you already trying to really see where the opportunities are? Do you need to convince your management, or are you already working on your sustainability report and to show what you've done? So if you could go to Menti, you see on the top, the menti.com, and use the code that's there. And you can already see some people are starting to answer the question. Great. So it already tells me a little bit where everybody's at. So I'll give you a few more seconds to really dive into the menti.com, get your phone out, get your laptop out, go to menti.com and give me some input on where I should be focusing today. And I can already see that a lot of people are still on the creating awareness level. Oh no, we're just changing that. So a lot of people are also working on figuring out where the opportunities are. Awareness is still doing good. I'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, so this is telling me quite a bit. Not so much traction on the fourth one, the validate and share resources, but the other ones are quite equal. So this shows me that we've got people from different parts of the innovation journey. People are really at the start, but also people that are already looking into different options and need to compare them. Okay, I'll move on. There's a few more questions where you can help me steer, but I have my input now. Thanks. So going forward, I'm going to the second step. So if you have very clearly, you know where you are in your innovation journey, you have clearly defined your needs, you know if you're going for a headline metric or performance indicator, or maybe both, and a few process indicators to double up on that, then it's time to really go where, okay, which metric, which indicators I'm going to use. So we're going to step 2. And this is quite, it's getting crowded in this sphere. So we've seen that when we first did the gap metric, which is about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, there weren't that many metrics out there. We kind of had to reinvent the wheel. But since, I would say 2 years, 1.5 years, 2 years, we've seen a couple of them coming up, sometimes competing, but sometimes also just having different strengths. But it is hard for some people to really see where you want to go. So what we've done at Circular Economy, having tested or being involved in the development of some of these metrics, we try to create an overview, and you can see that here now. So what we've done is try and see which metric is really focused on just a headline indicator or mostly focused on performance indicators. If they're really good at creating awareness, if you're at the beginning of your innovation journey, or if it's more about creating that business case or about reporting to shareholders, stakeholders, customers. So we tried to plot those metrics out there a bit on where they're good at. You can imagine that when I did this, we had a lot of conversations. A lot of the people behind these metrics came to me and tried to convince me that their metric could do actually everything. And sometimes they had a point, sometimes, but more often than not, they had to concede that, yes, we do have a focus. If you compare us to some of the others, our strength is really here. And that's what we've tried to convey in this message. So I think here I'm going to go for a second question to the group. And that's really just seeing where you are in all of these metrics. I'm very curious, did you already know of some of them, or maybe all of them? Or if you're very curious about one, then if I see some of them are really unfamiliar, I might go into them a little bit more. You can see, well, that was to be expected. A lot of people know Circularity already from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. That's about the most well-known out there, I would say. Cradle, of course, but let's give them credit, because Cradle is, I think, already decades old. So that was even there long before the circular economy sphere really grew that big. See, only a few people know about Circalogens, which is not that surprising. I know that's quite an unfamiliar one. I'm happy to see that some people actually know our own circularity gap metric. The GRI is doing well. It's mostly Cradle and Circularity. Okay, so what I'll do then is I'll highlight a few of them. I can't go through all of them, of course. If you want to know more, we've got a report on our website that goes through a few of them, but I'll highlight a few here because I'm assuming that you'll be interested. So I'm going to go through 3, and I already guessed that most people knew Circularity, so I'm not going into that one, but I'm going to mention our own circularity gap metric, the CTI framework, and the GRI standard, like you can see here. So they're a bit across the spectrum. That's also why I thought it was interesting to show them. So here's some of the information about these, just a high level, of course. So the circularity gap metric is actually really just almost a single metric. It's really just there to create awareness. That was why we designed it. It's really meant to show how bad the situation is, in all honesty, and that there's a lot of lost potential there, and we need to move. So it's really created to make sure that people understand the situation and want to move. And it's scientific based. I think it's about the only one right now. And that's kind of my worry as well, that we see a lot of these standards being developed, but there's not a lot of science behind it, which we did try to do with the gap metric. The one that I see having a lot of traction as well, which is a bit more not about awareness creation, can be used as well as for that, but really about opportunity, finding the opportunities for your business, is the circular transition indicators. Currently in their version 2, version 3 will be launched next year. We also use that metric quite a lot, that metric framework it actually is, And the benefit of that one is that it's really a self-assessment framework. It's meant for companies to use themselves. It's quite easy. It's also because it's designed with a lot of big players in the industry. The big companies are supporting that one. Has a free tool to it. One of the downsides of that tool, though, is it has a very narrow system boundaries. Basically, not exactly, but close to a gate-to-gate approach that they have to make it easy for the companies to look at. But of course, you're kind of ignoring parts of your value chain if you do that. And the last one I would also like to highlight is a GRI. GRI is, of course, a big framework where you have a lot of sustainability standards included. But there's one specifically that's more towards circular economy, which is a 306 standard. And I'm really expecting that one to take a bit of more of a leap in the coming years, to really make sure you report, especially bigger corporates. I'm assuming we'll start using that one to report towards in sustainability reports to their shareholders how they're doing on circular economy. It's not having a big uptake just now, but I have good hopes for that standard. So moving forward, we've applied quite a few of these.
Sorry, can I interrupt you briefly?
Yeah, please do.
Because we had a very interesting question on your previous slide that I thought would be interesting to quickly address.
Let's go back to that one then.
Which is about the circularity gap matrix being science-based and what science-based means in this context. So if you could quickly mention that to our audience, that would be very interesting. Yeah,
so what we meant by that is our starting point for developing the circularity gap metric. Actually, in all honesty, we didn't develop it. We've looked at literature, what academia were doing at that moment, and especially Dr. Haas from the Austrian University in Vienna. He developed a methodology that we thought, well, this looks promising, and we were going to try this out on the global economy, and that's how we developed the circularity gap metric. We had to adjust the methodology and improve it a little bit to make it work. But so we really started from a scientific point of view, where if you look at for instance, the CTI framework, they just looked at, okay, what does a company find interesting to measure? We're not going to look at how science would define it. They have some odd definitions in there, which an academic would never sign off on. But it works for business, so they just implemented it as such. And GRI is a little bit in between. They tried to be very systematic in the GRI, but it's a little bit in between the two approaches. And so far, the gap metric, as far as I know, is the only one that really started from a science perspective, an academic perspective. Thanks, Casper, for joining in on that one. And please, people, let's keep the questions coming. If you don't have time to answer them today, we'll try and get back to them later on. But in the meanwhile, I'll move on. So I've said already, we've been involved in a couple of these metrics. The GRI, we were advisor to the GRI, we were advisor to the CTI framework, and we developed the gap metric ourselves. But that's not to say that we are not facing a lot of challenges in applying them pretty much on a daily basis. And there's 3 here. I'll cover them in a little bit more detail later on. But you'll recognize them, and I'll just not to bash any other companies out there that are pioneering by developing a circularity metric. I'll just bash our own gap metric because these challenges apply to that metric as well. Actually, our gap metric is quite demanding when it comes to data. You really need data across your own value chain, much like the very extensive versions of LCAs out there. We haven't been able, at least for the business side, we applied the metric a lot on regions and countries and the global economy. When it comes to businesses, we only have tried it in a few case studies. So it's very immature, you could say. And hence, I mean, if you want to, you can find some of the academic literature and you could try and apply it yourself, but it will be quite hard to do it without a little bit of our assistance. So here already you see that it's going to be hard for others to actually apply this metric, and you'll see similar problems. And I'll mention a few examples later on with some of the other metrics out there as well. So now I'm going to move towards the third one, the collecting the data. And this is, of course, where it gets tricky, because companies, especially the bigger ones, some of the bigger multinationals we've worked with, they have huge data lakes. They have a lot of data. But if you look into it, it's all financial data, procurement data, customer data. But there's a newcomer that you'll need to really start measuring circular economy, and you need to implement that in your business intelligence, and that's material flow data. And it's surprising to see how well we are at monitoring your economy and your business, and how bad we are right now in monitoring material flow. So there's really a new field of expertise, which I expect to grow quite a bit in the coming years. And I'll just highlight a few of the things that you can use, because it's not just recycling and recovering data or waste production. You also will have to look into where are materials coming from, extraction data, how am I procuring this kind of materials, the production data, end of life data. It's really quite a complex overview that you'll need to create from and a whole new data set that you'll have to build as a business. And that's very challenging. We're quite used to actually using a lot of sector averages, proxy products, gap filling methods of just expert judgment to get you going, because nobody has all the data at the beginning. So you'll be challenged here, and you'll have to figure out how to go about it without having to spend years of just trying to find all that data. So here I have another question for everyone on the call. So I'm very curious, in your experience, if you look at your business, how much of that data do you think you already have? And I've mentioned just a couple of here. So you could look at the waste and emission data from your own business, from your own industry. But of course, equally important, maybe even more important for some businesses, is the data from your suppliers. How are they performing? Where are they getting their materials, etc. And something that a lot of people find surprising or are overlooking is also the rest of your value chain. How are your customers handling your materials? How is the end of life? But that use phase shouldn't be forgotten. That's actually where sometimes the commercial value really is. And yeah, well, this was kind of expected that we see, well, somewhere in the middle, people feel that they could have waste and emission data there already. I'm happy that at least half of the people here think they have some waste and emission data, but it's exactly where we see a lot of our work going, which is supplier data. I think in 3 out of the 4 projects that we do currently with our customers, we have to dive into the supply chain ourselves, either just add a lot of estimates in, sector averages, or reach out to the suppliers themselves to get the data. And I can see that's something you all recognize. Thanks again for that input. So here we come with the first the first challenge, data availability. And there are solutions out there. Some of you might already have been working on these kind of things, like creating a data lake for your organization, with going back to public data, buying private data sets, looking into technology options like IoT or blockchain. The holy grail, I would say, is even open data. I can go into definitions here, but if you want to know more, just reach out to us or Google away. But there's a lot of options out there to get the data that you need, and you'll have to start figuring out what the strategy is for you. One of the things that we did when we're looking to all these different metrics out there from the CTI framework or Circularity or Circularity is how complicated, or how do they handle the data? And we try to simplify it a little bit into which one just needs in-company data, which is just one circle assessment, which one will require to, if you really want to implement it well, to share data across your supply chain. So really get that information from your suppliers, maybe also from some of your upstream partners, or downstream partners. And there's a few out there like the GRI and the Cradle to Cradle that are actually really meant for you to share the data. So it's not just you getting the data to really understand your business, but these are created to really also share the data externally, so people know how you're doing and can use that again in their calculations. And a question we get a lot if I present this is, okay, but where do I get started? I recognize that I need data, but yeah, if I just pick up the phone and call my suppliers, there won't be a lot of answers here, and they'll just wonder why I'm asking all these questions. And in our experience, there's 3 ways that you can go about it. First of all, you can leverage natural evaluation points in your system. Take a supplier data if you have a contract renewal coming up and you have to restart negotiations with your supplier, that's the moment you can start asking for more questions. So one way you can go about it is just look at your list of suppliers. When is there some evaluation moments coming up, products that change, contracts that are renewed, and schedule them and go through those suppliers. And you'll need some time, but go through them one by one and tell them to provide more data. Another one is just start with a moonshot project. Really get the most innovative product for your sector out there and start developing it. Be the first to create a circular toothbrush, a circular car, a circular, I don't know, computer. Just be very ambitious, and you'll see suppliers, some suppliers will follow you. And that's the suppliers that will be willing to share a lot of data, hoping to learn from you, hoping maybe to also be part of your future plans. So you can just start with that product and those suppliers that are willing to really innovate with you and create that little ecosystem in which you have much more freedom and can move much faster than if you would go through all the list of suppliers. And the third option, and that's sometimes also what we are asked to facilitate, is sometimes you are just too small. Even the big multinationals sometimes feel they are too small to really get suppliers to move. But if you're joining forces with some of your peers, some of the other similar companies asking similar products from your suppliers, or you're delivering similar things to your customers, you can join forces and say, okay, well, we're gonna commit ourselves to setting a new standard in the sector. And in our experience, sometimes, and I have one example that I can actually mention, the Capital Equipment Coalition that we have, where there's big companies there that really produce the big machines. It's going from Dell and Cisco to a big shipyard producer, Damon, to a agricultural robot manufacturer, Lely. And what they did, they all make claims like, we're going to join forces, and in a couple of years, we're all going to move much more towards a circular future. And even without them reaching out to their suppliers themselves, it was noticed. And you saw some suppliers actually reaching out to us again and say, hey guys, we see all our important customers are moving, and we're kind of getting scared. We also need to move now. Can you help us connect to them and understand where we're going? And that was not because they reached out to them. It's just the public knowledge that they were moving that made suppliers move. So I'll move forward to the fourth one. Or Casper, do you have some questions that I could answer at this point? If not, I'll just continue, and feel free to drop in, and if there's any interesting questions to answer. So
Jaco, sorry, actually, yeah. Thanks for pausing for a moment, because there's a couple of very interesting questions coming in. One that I'd like to actually address now is because we were using a lot of different terminologies, and just to create some clarity on the difference between a standard and a metric, because Elaine has been asking what the difference is, because she thought, for instance, that the GRI 306 was actually a standard. So maybe you can shed some light on that. Yeah. In all honesty, when we started writing a white paper 2 years ago on the current state of affairs with business metrics, we had that same problem. There's so many terminology going on. You have metrics, indicators, frameworks, standards. So I felt the need to, at least for myself, after a lot of Googling and finding different definitions, at least for ourselves, define what we mean by it. I'm not quite sure if a linguist will agree with how I define it, but this is how I interpret it. I would say it starts with an indicator. An indicator is just a number and a unit, and it's telling you something. The indicator turns into a metric when there is a clear methodology behind it that tells you how to measure. A metric is about measuring. So not just about the number, but also how to measure it. If just the amount of greenhouse gas emissions, that's an indicator. If you have used a greenhouse gas protocol to measure it, that's a metric. A metric can actually, a methodology can lead towards more than one indicator, obviously. If you look at some like the CTI framework that I mentioned, that has, I think, about 15, 20 indicators in there. GRI the same. Then when a metric becomes kind of the industry standard and is used a lot, obviously it then becomes a standard. It can be an informal standard, it's just used a lot and everybody recognizes it as the best practice,
or you can put it into an official standard with the ISO, with the GRI. So I would agree, actually, it's the GRI is a standard. It's a standard that describes the metrics that you need to use to report on, in this case, circular economy. I'm hoping that's making it a bit clear. I know this is often quite confusing, and sometimes we use the terms indicators and frameworks and metrics interchangeably, but at least I hope that this clarifies a little bit what I mean by it. Are there any other questions, Casper, or shall I move on?
There has been one more question on the alignment with the circular economy taxonomy and the CSRD, but I think we'd like to tackle that more towards the end of the presentation.
Yeah, very good question. I'm indeed going to use that a little bit as a outro of today's meeting, but I'm definitely going into that, and feel free to re-ask your questions if I didn't address them sufficiently at the end. Okay, well, if that's there, oh, and I see some people are also mentioning the ISO standard. There is indeed right now also an ISO standard in development. We're part of that, as like 100 other organizations. It's a huge crowd working on that ISO standard. If you're hoping that will help you start measuring circularity, don't get your hopes up too much. It's a topic in there. It's definitely how they'll describe it, but it's also, they're working on a consensus basis. ISO really just writes down the current consensus in the industry. And the problem is there is not a lot of consensus. A lot of things are debated, definitions are debated. Actually, the taxonomy is a great help, and at least some authoritative body saying, now this is how we define things. So the ISO standard is much needed because it will really level up the professionality of the sector, but it's definitely not going as far as the standards that we're describing today, like the GRI or the CTI. I'm going to continue to the fourth step, which is computing and analyzing. Obvious step if you apply metrics, of course. So, and I'm starting right into where the challenges are, because here it gets really challenging, of course. I mean, if you have the data, well, data we can fix. Like I said, we usually are asked by our partners to really just help get some estimates in on data. And if it's a bad estimate, sometimes your best estimate is good enough to actually at least have a baseline and start improving on it. But then we are now going about the maturity of all these metrics. And again, I need to give credit to the Cradle to Cradle framework, because that's actually very mature and it's definitely very useful. But if you look at this table, we created something that we call the methodology readiness levels. So how ready, how mature is the methodology, going from a theoretical test in level 1 to a fully tested and standardized and publicized standard as the Cradle to Cradle certificate. You can see the metrics that we've mentioned are all across there, from our gap metric. Like I said in the beginning, we've only tested that in a few cases, at least for businesses, to the GRI, which is somewhere in between. It is assessed quite thoroughly with the community and it's published, but actually it's still a small amount of applications that you've seen. But the CTI and Circularity are really already getting quite mature. You'd think, if you see and how it was developed, how often it's tested and applied now. But don't get your hopes up too much. And I have a funny example that from one of our recent projects, where we worked for a retailer, a big retailer. They had hundreds, thousands of different products in, and we scanned a big part of their portfolio on how circular it is and how they could use their buying power to improve that circularity in their value chain. And we used the CTI framework for that, version 2. And we went to their towels, their plates and cutlery, to the garden furniture and their toys. And the CTI framework worked beautifully, and we really it really helped them a lot. And then we came to personal care, and I put the shampoo here as an example of a product that we looked into. And if you use the CTI framework, shampoo is near impossible to get circular. It's just really hard. And that's because they expect that if you put water into a product, that water needs to go back to the watershed where it was originally extracted. So if you produce shampoo in Poland and you then move it to the Netherlands, they would expect you to bring that water back to Poland again, even though water might not actually be an issue. Another issue is that the CTI, if something goes into a sewage system, that kind of by definition, it's a bit more complicated than that, but almost by definition, CTI would regard that as lost, as not circular, even though a lot of the materials going in there might actually be neutralized or recovered by sewage plants. It's not considered at all. So if you take all that into account, then it's very hard to really make a shampoo circular. And for us as more or less the consultants of this retail company, it was really hard to really then say, okay, if this is the data, then this is our advice to you, because the data was pointing us to ridiculous bits of advice that we wouldn't give. So actually for the personal care products, we kind of moved back and said, well, we'll go about it qualitatively rather than quantitatively, because the current standards just don't help here. So even the CTI framework, which I would say is about the more mature ones out there, except for the Creative Cradle, which is really mature, even that one has its flaws still, and we'll need to have further improvements, hence the version 3 that's coming out next year. Okay, so that was just an example on how maturity. Another issue, if you're doing the computation, is expertise. Like I said, material flow data is not something that companies are very familiar with and to deal with. So a lot of people are struggling with the terminology, the methodology, can't really judge the quality of data. So you see also quite a bit of difference between these different standards in how easy it is, what kind of expertise you need to apply them. Some of them have a lot of resources available online, which can really help you to understand what you're doing. Others have tools available, even like the CTI framework has a free online tool that you can use and will guide you to it. Circularity is the same, has a really nice tool that will help you through it. Circularity is one of those things that's developed by a consultant, the BCG, Boston Consulting Group. Quite expensive to apply, but it really has a nice flow to it. And some actually really require you to have a third party involved. Like you can't do a Creative Cradle assessment yourself and get that certification. You'll have to have a third party join you. Same with Circularity that I just mentioned from the Boston Consulting Group. The only way to apply that is by having them on board. And that, of course, puts a really good current guarantee on the outcome. It really, like, you know, it's been done properly, but also comes with a cost, of course. So it's really also assessing what kind of expertise do I have in-house, and what kind of support do I want or do I need, and then figuring out which metric fits to that. Going forward, I'm already going to step 5, so we're nearing the end of my story a little bit, and that's where the fun starts, of course. I mean, we're an impact organization in circular economy. We're about getting things into action, even if it's about metrics and measuring. The goal always is to get things to move. So step 5, here it is. And this is kind of our favorite approach, and it kind of matches what I told you in the beginning. We usually start with a system mapping phase where we use metrics to set a baseline, identify where the areas of improvement are. Then we go to a visioning phase. We try, okay, go sit together. Let's see where we want to go. What kind of targets do we fit with that future vision? What kind of metrics do we fit with that? And can we use that to brainstorm on opportunities? And then go to phase 3, where you can use metric to calculate the potential of individual opportunities. What you'll see here is this is already combining a few of these steps that I mentioned in the beginning, where different parts of your innovation journey. So obviously we always try to see if we can minimize the complexity and the amount of metrics in there, but sometimes we really are forced to also kind of mix and match the indicators in each of these phases. And I have a few examples here, and I'm looking how I'm doing on time. I think I'm doing quite well. So I'll go into some examples just to give some flavor to what I'm telling you. And these are examples from our own projects or from public publications. So the first one, I'm going to go left to right here. The first one I'm going to mention is Rockwool. They are one of the world's biggest producers of insulation materials for buildings, but also for industrial complexes and industrial processes. And they really wanted to have a metric to show how good they're doing on it, because they felt they were already quite far ahead. And in all fairness, they were performing quite well. They themselves, as Rockwool, they used a lot of secondary resources. They had a product that was perfectly recyclable. The problem was their value chain. there were a lot of issues in their value chain, especially towards the end of life, that would really hamper any reuse. So there was almost no circularity if you looked at the complete value chain. And what Rockwool did is, now we've got a number to it, we can really pinpoint where these issues are and who's next to move, because it really helped them to say, okay, we've done our part, now you guys. Then we also worked together with the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce. For them, we used the circle assessment tool that we have. I haven't mentioned it. It's in the overview that I've shown a few times, but I haven't mentioned it so far. It's a really easy tool. It's not going very deep. It's not having a lot of, it doesn't even have quantified indicators, only qualitative indicators. But because it's so easy to use, the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce could use it to initiate discussions with tens and hundreds of different SMEs, offering them this easy, quick online assessment. And then based on that, they had a bit of a baseline. They could start conversations and see, okay, here are my biggest opportunities to move. So that was their goal. Glasgow wanted, the Chamber of Commerce wanted to start conversations with these companies, these SMEs, where to move. So that was a different metric they used there than Rockwool did. Then Action is a big, if you don't know, it's quite a big retailer in Western Europe, Central Europe as well. I think even Poland, so Eastern Europe a little bit as well. And they're really using it to inform their buying processes. So they're really trying to build, compare different options before they go to their suppliers and say, okay, I want you to produce the product in a different way, because I now know that by comparing the different options, this is actually a better way to go. And then the most fun example I have here, because I thought it was so interesting that Microsoft was one of the first big companies to really apply the CTI metric that I've mentioned now a few times. And that was quite interesting to see such a big company being a first mover in there. If you look back at their sustainability report on their devices, they did the calculations, said, well, we used the CTI metric, and we now calculated that our all our devices are 24% circular on average, like if you combine everything. And I thought that was quite impressive that they did that. And they did that mostly to put in their sustainability report, to report about it, really as a means to, through their investors, their shareholders, to communicate what they're doing. The problem though is they said, well, we compared it to the global average, which is 9%, like it's told you in the beginning. So we're doing far better than the global average. And that was completely false, because the methodologies are wildly different. The system boundaries are wildly different. The CTI frame will always give you a higher metric than the gap, the circularity gap report will. So it was a comparison that really couldn't be made. But Microsoft didn't understand it, because both metrics actually end up with percentage circularity. And nobody really described really well how the percentage circularity is actually very different. So here you see the problem also in standardization, harmonization, and really the immatureness of all these methodologies.
Jacco, quickly jumping in with another question that we've received really fits what you're talking about right now. And that question is about the level of alignment that we've seen between different frameworks. To what extent have they been talking about? Because we see that a percentage circularity for one product or company may not be comparable to another. So are you aware of some alignment that has been going on?
Yes, I'm aware, and I'm afraid the answer is just a little bit. What you've seen that, let's say, if you would look at uptake, I would say the biggest standards or metrics in use right now are Circularity from Aaron McCarter. It's the CTI framework from the World Business Council that I've mentioned a few times, and it's the GRI standard. And these three have sat down together to figure out how it all fits together. But the level of integration they had was, okay, we see that you have this metric in your standard, we have this metric in our methodology, and they're quite similar. So let's show it to the outside world that these two match, and you can kind of interchangeably compare them. But they didn't change their methodologies, they didn't change their definitions or even the terminology. They just said, okay, these two terms, one used in the GRI, one used in Circularity, they're actually quite similar and comparable. So that's the level of harmonization you had so far, and I've seen little interest to really move that further right now. You all see that they're just working on their own uptake and improving the methodology. I do expect, and I will come to that in my next step, the 6th step, I do expect that will change quite fast. because of the EU taxonomy and the CSRD coming up, but I'll go into that in a little bit more detail in a minute. So no, there's not a lot of harmonization. It's a short answer to that question.
Perfect. Thanks, Jaco.
Okay, then I'll move on. The next one, the last step, and this is going to be a bit of my call to action to all of you, because this is why everybody should start caring about it, even if you're not completely convinced about the approach or where you want to go with circular economy. I'm pretty sure you'll have to, and this is why. Have you heard about the CSRD? And the question already came in at a moment. I expect that some people probably don't know it, also because we have people from the Americas and India and Brazil and South Africa here, because so I'll explain a little bit in a minute what this really is about. You can already see it's the directive of the European Parliament. But before I dive into it and really start talking about the details of it, I'll just have my last question to you guys with the Mentimeter again, is have you heard about it, the CSRD? And if so, are you already preparing for it? I'm really curious to see. It's been also quite a topic for us lately. I've known some of our partners and clients have been very anxious about this happening. Others have never heard about it. And as a bit of a hint already, the CSRD is very much linked to the EU taxonomy. And I'll explain in a little bit in a while what it is, why that is the case. And I can see the answers already are a bit spread out. A lot of people have no clue what it is about. So I'll go into it in a little bit and explain more. I think two said we're already preparing ourselves. And one is saying we're well prepared. I'm really well prepared. I'm really curious who that one person is, because you probably then know more than I do, because I have no clue yet how I can prepare our clients for what's coming right now. Okay, so as I expected, a lot of people don't know a lot of what it's about, so I'll dive into it right now. The CSRD is a new bit of legislation coming in for the EU. So that's really, you would say, mostly relevant for those people here on the call that are in the EU, but I'll explain a little bit why that's not that simple. This directive, this new legislation, will apply to 50,000 near 50,000 companies in the 50,000 biggest companies in the EU, and is replacing the NFRD, which was the previous bit of legislation on how to report on sustainability. So they now are changing how these 50,000 should be, 50,000 companies should be reporting on sustainability. So it basically more than quadruples the amount of companies that need to have, are obliged to have a sustainability report in Europe. And there's a couple of more changes. The second change is, previously the NFRD said, well, if you do a sustainability report, just really you have to write down how the sustainability problems are affecting your business, like what are issues that really affect your supply chain, etc. Now they say, okay, well, that's all nice and all, but now you also need to describe how you're affecting sustainability of society at large. So not just if it's really relevant for your business or business model or your customers, but really if you're impacting anyone on sustainability, you need to start reporting on it. So it's a bigger scope. It's called double materiality if somebody wants to look it up. It's quite a difficult concept, but this is kind of what it means. The third step is that they're going to describe in much more detail than currently in the legislation what you need to report upon. So it's much more detailed, a lot more mandatory elements. And it will also move sustainability. So right now, a lot of these companies will have a separate sustainability report every year. These 50,000 companies are not allowed to do that in the future. They'll have to move sustainability reports into their financial yearly report. So the yearly reports will now have a financial element to it and a non-financial element, which also means that all these accountants out there, KPMG, EY, Deloitte, they'll also have to prove and assure and check the sustainability part. So suddenly you see that the KPMGs of this world are really massively building out their sustainability departments, because they now have a lot of companies coming their way that really need to report on and need somebody to check what they're reporting upon on sustainability. And a nice other thing is that all these 50,000 will be obliged to also digitally tag the information, so it's searchable for others to really easily come to benchmarks and things. Why it's not just interesting for those 50,000 companies is a lot of what they have to report upon is actually is affecting their value chain. So they'll have to go to their suppliers, their customers to ask questions about sustainability. So even if you're not that big, or even if you're not in Europe, but you're supplying to companies in Europe, they'll start asking you questions because they need to report on something. So it's going to trickle down a lot through in different parts of the world. And the good part, at least for us as a circular economy, is that circularity is mentioned very specifically as one of the topics in there. It's going to be one of 6 topics that you need to report upon. And you can see it here. The problem, which they already recognized when they did their scoping, and this is a table you see from their scoping exercise, is that there's not a lot of data points out there yet. So right now there's a commission working in Brussels to figure out, like, what are we going to oblige everybody to report upon, because there's not much yet out there. So what parts can we make mandatory and whatnot? But you can already see, and that's the blowout that I have here, they have been talking to the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the WBCSD, who made the CTI framework. So the CTI framework is under consideration, and they've been talking to Ellen MacArthur Foundation about Circulytics, and they've been talking to the GRI. So the big 3 emerging standards in the circular economy field. They've been talking to all 3 of them. So I'm very curious, and that will be next year, to see what they'll make mandatory. If it's just 2 simple indicators on what kind of waste do you produce, or if you're going to make it mandatory to do full value chain analysis and really report on waste produced throughout and what you're doing to improve your circularity. So that's going to be very interesting in 2022 to realize what's coming here. I can see there's a question, Casper, or not?
Yes, there's a question on this, just to also check in with regards to our own experience in supporting companies with circular metrics to align also with the taxonomy and the CSRD. So maybe you can give a quick update to what extent we are supporting or will be supporting companies in this.
It's basically a question we get from any new project that we start. Like, can you help us also prepare for the CSRD? And I'm giving them the same answer I'm giving you guys right now, is that I hope I'm preparing you for that, because what we can apply the CTI frame. We're not applying Circularity so much, I'll admit, but we can apply the circular transition indicators, the CTI framework. We can apply the GRI framework if you want us to. And I think, because I can see that these guys are talking, I think that will prepare you for what's to come. But I don't know. I think the first public consultation on the first standards going out is Q1 next year. So it's quite soon already. And we'll have to see. And right now they're in the ivory tower. They're not talking to a lot of people. Nobody really knows, because obviously there's a lot of people lobbying for things and really eager to get a competitive advantage out of this. If KPMG would be the first to know what to be reporting on, you can make sure they'll be approaching those 50,000 companies tomorrow. But nobody knows. So we'll have to wait and see a little bit. If also for us, if we're preparing our clients sufficiently, I hope I am. We just don't know.
And do you already know when the CSRD will then be fully implemented?
Well, that's a bit of a complex answer. I think all elements are going to be finally implemented and obligatory in 2026, so that's far off. But that means that you need to monitor 2025, so then you already need to be prepared. But certain elements are already going to be obligatory in 2023. So the first elements are really already going to be mandatory in that year, which means you need to report about 2022. So this is why a lot of people are getting anxious. They are worried that starting next year, starting 1st of January, they'll actually have to start already build up that database that they'll need to report upon it, because some parts they'll have to already report in 2 years from now. Also, this is still quite a question mark, but it's having a lot of people, especially with these 50,000 bigger companies, worried, but it will trickle down, like I said. Others will also have to follow suit.
Perfect. Thanks, Jaco. I also wanted to ask one more question from Tommaso, who is asking about the applicability of these established frameworks, such as CTI and Circulytics, not only on the product level, but also in the context of producers of materials or components. So he's saying that some of the data you need really depends on choices made by these big brands who produce the final product. So how does that work?
seeing the time, I fear I have not enough time to really go into detail on this. What I can say is that the answer depends a bit on the kind of metrics and indicators that you want to use, because some of these metrics out there are really meant to be applied more on an organizational level. For instance, the GRI framework is meant to, you report as a company, not on a product, you report as a company. Whereas if you look at the CTI framework, it's actually far more easy to apply that to a product rather than a whole business. So it depends a bit on which metric to use. And I mean, I've hardly mentioned it today, but you can also still develop your own indicators, of course, and make sure that these indicators fit the purpose that you have, which is also still quite a question we get a lot from companies, to help them develop their own indicators.
Indeed, and it's also been another question online, so thanks for already answering that. I believe now we're hitting the final minute, so we will be closing here, but if we go to the next slide, please know this won't be the last you hear from us about this. We will be continuously publishing also further reports and on this topic that you can find on our website, Circular Economy /metrics. And you're, of course, free to reach out to us. You have Jacco's contact details here. Important to say is also that we will be publishing the recording and the slides from today. So once again, thank you so much for joining today. We really enjoyed the session, and sorry to everyone whose question we couldn't get to. We hope to do so also directly, but also again, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to work together on this. So thanks all.
Yeah, thanks. Really enjoyed today.
Bye-bye.